Welcome back to the Deeply Rested podcast. What does it mean to be an ethical business owner? Since you're listening to this podcast, I'm guessing you're the kind of entrepreneur who wants to operate an ethical business, stay out of trouble, and avoid harming your clients and colleagues. You have really good intentions, but are good intentions good enough? Today's guest has the answer. Say hello to Gina Gomez. Gina is a seasoned business strategist with 25 plus years of experience. She's the founder of Arista Management Group, a female-led and minority-driven consultancy where the company specializes in guiding visionaries in arts and entertainment. Gina is dedicated to merging business acumen with a commitment to diversity. And in this episode, Gina walks us through the specific actions we can take to strengthen our business's ethical foundation. For me, conversations about ethics often feel vague and philosophical. I enjoy them, but I don't know what to do with them. Gina does an excellent job of bringing the philosophical down to earth by explaining how we can translate our good intentions into a solid ethical foundation for our businesses. This conversation with Gina was originally recorded for our fundraising event, the Rest and Success Code. It is chock full of really important information, and I am thrilled to be sharing it with you today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this thought-provoking conversation with Gina Gomez. Welcome to Deeply Rested, the podcast that helps people doing good work in the world take incredibly good care of themselves. I'm your host, retired therapist, and disillusioned business coach, Megan Megginson. I'm on a mission to help people like you unlearn the rules that keep you trapped in self-doubt so that you can recover from burnout and finally become deeply rested. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe to this podcast and join our weekly newsletter at deeplyrested.com/newsletter. Now, it's time for the show. Gina, welcome.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'm so excited.
I am thrilled to have you here today, and I'm very excited about what I know is going to be a really juicy conversation about success and ethics and how do we create alignment for ourselves as business owners. So are you ready to do this?
I'm so ready. And here's why, because our conversations tend to naturally go into deep waters. And it's one of the things I look forward to the most. So let's dive in.
Yes. Oh my gosh, me too. Well, I want to start with a little story for our listeners. So I have worked with Gina on and off for a couple of years now. And I was on a coaching call with Gina back in June. I think it was like May or June. And Gina, I was sharing an ethical dilemma with you, as I do, as one does. We share ethical dilemmas with Gina. And I was sitting between two big decisions. And without going into details, I had an option A and an option B. And option A was the choice people expected me to make. It was the choice that societally made the most sense. It was the choice that was going to make me the most money, but something about it didn't feel quite right to me. Option B felt very right to me, but everyone was telling me I was a fool for choosing option B. And I was sitting here saying to you, Gina, like, I know I need to choose option B, but am I crazy? Like, everyone's telling me I'm crazy. What's going on here? And you said something to me in that conversation that I'll never forget and that I want to dive deeper in with you today. You said, Megan, most business owners are afraid of making the ethical choice. And they're not afraid of making the ethical choice because they don't want to make the right decision. They're afraid of making the ethical choice because they think if they do, that their business will fail. Like if they make the ethical choice, they won't be able to succeed. And the seed that you planted in my mind, Gina, with that statement has just really germinated over the past few months. And I want to know if we can just like right out of the gate, can you tell me why you think business owners believe this? Why do they believe that they can't be both ethical and successful?
Well, first, thank you for not saying, and I haven't made an ethical decision since. I think it's a few things. I think for one, we don't have, like, let's be honest. When you look around at the world, especially today, we don't have a lot of examples of where people have been consistently ethical and successful, unless we really look for them. Because usually what gets highlighted is when people do unethical things.
Mm.
So that's also the way that we get taught, whether it's a positive way of learning or not. It is part of the way we get taught. I think also when you were sharing about when you started telling people what you were interested in or considering, people started to put pressure on you, and the responses were negative. And sometimes we don't make the choice because we don't want to deal with that, but also sometimes it incites so much fear with other people that we take on that fear.
Ooh.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So then that makes it even scarier, because it's like, well, if I'm feeling scared now, how am I going to feel when I make these decisions to follow through? And I feel like I'm sitting alone because no one supports me in that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is, I do think that there are people who think that they can be ethical and successful until they're in a situation that poses some kind of ethical dilemma or decision that needs to be made that forces someone to examine or question their own ethics.
Mm. Do you have an example of that?
Sure. I think there are a few. So one would be something like selling something that doesn't bring the results that your marketing or your copy says that it does. And you know that, but you stick with it because you just need to make money.
Mm.
Or you think that you'll go back and figure it out later and revise it. But usually what happens is once you let that, like you bend the rule, it becomes easier to bend it the next time. And then soon you realize that you don't have the rule because it's so bended and so twisted that now this is the new rule or the new form of behavior or business practice. Another one would be something like very simple, padding time to increase billable hours or using scare tactics. Like I've heard people say things like, you can't afford not to buy this course, or using things like, and I'm not opposed to NLP because I think NLP can help people in a lot of ways. But when you use it to close sales, what it tells me is you don't even believe in what you're selling because you have to use.
And for those who aren't familiar, can you say what NLP is?
Neuro-linguistic programming is
yes,
I understand.
Processing or programming, yeah, one of those two things. So using
it feels like programming to me. That's probably where I came up with that.
Right. Yeah. So these are really great examples specifically to like marketing your business, right? When you maybe make a claim that isn't true or use a strategy that's based more in like exploitation or manipulative persuasion than it should be. I want to circle back in just a minute to these examples you're giving around like why people believe they can't be ethical and successful. But first, I'm thinking it might be helpful if we sort of define what we mean by ethics. Do you have a definition that you use when you're thinking about what it means to be ethical?
Well, I'll tell you, when I was preparing for the interview, I was thinking a lot about like what we would talk about. And so I was making some notes and thinking about the definition of ethics, right? Which is a set of moral principles that a person lives by, usually through their behavior. But there are also different types of ethics. So for example, there are normative ethics, and those are the things that are the norms or the standards of conduct. So it can be something that's like right or wrong, like don't lie, don't be mean, or let's use don't like, that's a cleaner one. Or meta is another type of ethic. And those are more around ethical judgments and theory. So we think about things like moral language. So for example, intuition. Intuition is not necessarily, it's not the same as fact, but it doesn't mean that if you use your intuition, you're wrong. But sometimes people will say, well, I just know this. And it's like, well, how do you know this? And it's like, I just know. So if you're not clear on, is this factual or is this a feeling, that could be misleading. And people who don't believe in using intuition can also see it as unethical. If I use intuition to guide my business and to make recommendations to my clients, and I'm not forthright about that with a client who does not believe in that, that could come back, that could cause harm, but it could also come back and hurt me. If that person said, I made decisions based on what you told me because of your experience, and you went on a hunch, I may see it differently because those aren't my ethics. Right. But if it doesn't align with someone else's ethics, and that's my client, that can bring some confusion. And then the other would be applied. And those are the normative theories to moral problems. So things like business ethics, legal ethics, and even medical ethics all fall under those things. So the question becomes, what happens when they differ? So for example, let's say I'm a doctor and I say, I never compromise quality if it puts a patient's life at risk. But what if I'm that same doctor and I say, but I might compromise quality if I know it's not going to create a life or death situation?
It's a gray area.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes a thing of like, do we decide I'm all or nothing? Do we fall into the gray? But I think it's really important for us to know where we fall in those things. I think it's when we pretend like it's not really something and we sweep it under the rug. like here's what I always think is that when we're not being ethical, we know we're not being ethical.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You just gave us a 2-minute masterclass, I feel like, in ethics. Like, what are they? What are all the different types of ethics? Would you mind repeating the very first definition you shared? I think it's more like the dictionary definition of ethics.
Yeah, that it's like a set of morals or principles that are usually exhibited by through behavior actions.
Yeah. So a set of moral principles. And I think you said something before about like moral principles that like guide your life. Like that there's a set of moral principles that you decide what your moral principles are. So there's an element of choice, of intentionality around ethics. Like, what do you think is ethical? And I want to hone in on this for a minute, Gina, because I feel like part of what's happening right now in the business, in the small business industry, in the online business space especially, is that people are just throwing around the word ethics left and right. And it's something that people are like dodging, like they want to like say the right thing. They want to talk the talk, but they don't actually know how to walk the walk. And maybe it's because people haven't spent time individually really getting clear on what are my ethics as a business owner? Like, what do I believe and how can I create systems in my own business that align with the values and the ethics that I'm saying are important to me? Do you have thoughts about that?
I do, because I think we're very quick to point out when someone else is unethical, especially if it's someone we admire or follow. So it's a little bit like, like the saying about like people with glass houses shouldn't throw stones. So it's a little bit like, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have opinions on ethics or we shouldn't vote with our feet, like the saying goes, where we leave a business because we choose not to work with them because ethically we're not a match. But I think what happens is when we're not clear on who we are, what we stand for, what our core values are, who we align with, and all of those things that play into it, it's very hard to, one, to be consistent, two, to show our market and our customer base who we really are, because we're like a moving target, right? Like, don't figure me out. So I'm over here, but don't figure me out. So I think it's really important to take a step back and look at some of the biggest challenges in our lives, in our careers, and look at what were moral challenges or ethical challenges and ask, what was the challenge? Why was it hard to make this decision? And that will start to inform you. So I always try to look at things from a lens of compassion. Sometimes it's easier than others, but I'll give you an example that's a little off, but it can kind of tie to this. So recently I saw a news piece where there was a guy who robbed a liquor store. He went into the liquor store. They were just showing like a 30-second news piece. He goes in the liquor store. And now when I'm watching it without the sound, I just see somebody who's masked, walks into a liquor store, points a gun, and is taking money and then leaves. When I watched it with the sound, because then I just had it on and then I turned up the sound. When I watched it with the sound, what had been missing was the audio of the guy who was robbing the owner of the liquor store, apologizing profusely the entire time. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Now, I'm not saying that makes it okay that this person stole. I completely disagree with that behavior. but it helped me have a little bit of compassion to stop and say, what would drive this person to feel like that was the only choice?
Mm.
What situation is this person in to feel that is their only option, but to break the law and to steal? So it's an extreme example, but it's the same thing when these kinds of things come up. So if I'm having to use scare tactics or scarcity tactics to get someone to say yes, that's me. What am I going through that I feel that that's the only way that I can sell? Is it a lack of confidence? Is it a lack of finances? Is it a lack of experience? Is it something else? What is it? But it's really important for us to look at that and identify it, because it's not up to other people to figure it out for us.
That
And
feels so
who you are.
important. Yeah, you have to know who you are, and you have to. So you said this a few minutes ago. I want to circle back to it, that it's really easy to point the finger at other people. It's really easy to, sit in your bed scrolling through Instagram, like going like, oh my God, I can't believe this person is doing that. Or, chatting with a colleague. Did you hear so-and-so in the office down the street did this? It's easy to point the finger. It's easy to call other people out for being, quote, unethical. But how many of us actually take the time, and I'm included in this category. I'm like, this conversation already has me thinking more deeply about how I need to do a better job defining my own ethics and not looking to you or to other people that I admire to say, okay, Megan, this is what is ethical and this is what isn't ethical. This is not ethical, but how have you defined your ethics personally and the ethics for your business, so that when you are thinking about what strategies you're going to use, what marketing tactics you're going to use, you have something to measure your ideas against, but something that comes from within you. So I'm curious if you have any ideas or suggestions for maybe how people can begin to do that. How can they start to think about ethics in their own businesses? And are there maybe any categories or tips about things they should prioritize to get the gears turning?
I love this. So let me start with this. I don't feel that it's up to me to tell others what's ethical and moral. I also think it's really important to say that when you're exploring this, to be really, really clear that this does not mean that you will never make a mistake, that you will only choose the ethical things. Because when we set intentions like this, where we say, okay, I'm going to look at my ethics, I'm going to look at how I practice in my business, and I'm going to start to put this into practice. Opportunities show up for us to be like, okay, Megan, let's see if you really are ready to put your ethics to work. So that's why I feel like it's really important to say, this is a practice, and sometimes you'll get it right. Sometimes you may not get it right, but it's what we do with that after that will define who we are. If we make a mistake and we continue to make mistakes, that's one story. If we make a mistake and we choose to learn from it and do better going forward, that's another approach, right? So one of the things I would say that it's really, really critical to understand and to know is your core values and your personal ethics. So one, do you have them? Do you know what they are? Do you follow them? And to think about, like, this is what I used to think about a lot in early on in my career, was thinking about the business or the business person that I always wanted to be, and who I admired and why I admired those people. And usually they were people who were extremely ethical. Not always, because sometimes I missed the mark. And it was like I'd learn something about them and be like, oh, well, that was not what I thought it was going to be. But when we understand and know who we are and know our own core values and our own ethics, then it does become easier to see when something's not in alignment. It doesn't necessarily mean that it makes it easy to walk away from something, but it makes it clearer that if we choose not to walk away, that we're choosing to be complicit in something that does not align with our core values. And we have to reckon with that. So I think about areas like, what you sell, how you sell, who you work with, who you partner with, who you endorse, your customers and clients, and do your actions match your words? It's also really important to know these things, because if you're in leadership, your team has to know what is the code of ethics in the company. And is this a fit for me as an employee or as a contractor if you work with contractors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm like listening to you and taking notes here. I'm like, okay, this is great. This is so good. Because I feel like what you're doing is sort of operationalizing ethics for us, which is what we need in order to really thoughtfully and intentionally create our own code of ethics for ourselves and our businesses. I think so many people are just really overwhelmed by what's right, what's wrong, what's ethical, what's not ethical. People are afraid of getting canceled. People are afraid, there's so much fear right now that it's keeping people in this fight or flight response around making sure that it looks like they're, doing the right thing from the outside when really that's not what this work is about. It's really about dropping in and asking yourself, what are my core values? What are my personal ethics? How do I want the people who work with me in my business to operate? How do we know together what decisions we're okay making, what decisions we're not okay making? And it's not something that we have to, it's not like a wing and a prayer.
Right.
Okay, fingers crossed we do the right thing here. No, what I'm hearing you say is you can really define your code of ethics for yourself and your business, and then you have a map that will guide you through, tricky decisions. If it's about selling, if it's about client work, if it's about managing relationships with the community, you don't have to make it up as you go along. You can use your personal code of ethics to really guide how you are staying in alignment or not staying in alignment sometimes, because we all make mistakes with what we have decided is right versus wrong. Am I getting that right?
Yes. And I think it's important to also look at the experiences that influence how we define our ethics.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because I think about, for example, when I was younger, I saw the world as very, right and wrong, black and white, yeah, all of those things. Yes and no. It was very, very clear. And then I became a grown-up and I started experiencing things and witnessing things where I was like, oh, everything is not so clear cut, where it's yes and no, black and white, all of those things. And so it helped me start to look at things not from a place of like, oh, so it is okay to steal. It was never anything like that. It was just more like, oh, so for example, growing up, I grew up Catholic, and everything was like, you go to church on Sunday. If you're Catholic, like extramarital affairs are wrong and all those things. And I had very, very strong opinions around everything that I was raised in because I was taught that's what I was supposed to believe, not because it's what I truly believed.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to go through a period where a lot of the things I still believe, I don't practice Catholicism, but a lot of the things I still believe, but there are other things that I don't believe because of the experiences that I had. They tell me something differently. So it's not a thing of like, oh, I break 8 out of the 10 commandments. It's just more like, I understand why that came to pass. That's just not how I practice or live my life.
Again, it's that intentional choice, the personal choice.
Right.
You sat with the options that were handed to you by the culture or the society that you were a part of. And then you really discerned internally, what do I agree with and what do I not agree with? And now what decisions do I make in my life so that I can feel like everything I'm doing is in alignment with what I'm saying my values and my ethics actually are.
And what I learned by really starting to question a lot of what I was taught to believe wasn't about changing my mind about things. It was really understanding why I believe these things.
Yeah.
And the things that I was questioning, why am I questioning those things?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that as we evolve as human beings, you may even find as you get older or you have a different experience or, the people that influence your life, that you might revisit some of those things. Typically, ethics it's not like a thing where every Friday you're like, what are my ethics this week? Or how am I going to show up in the world? Usually you don't see them change a lot, but you will start to see things change a little bit based on your experience.
Yeah, I think this questioning bit is really important. Let's go into this for a minute. The questioning, why do I believe what I believe?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or why in my business, why do I do what I do? Where does this come from? And especially when we're thinking about our businesses, it's hard to, I mean, I've been in this process for a while now. It is painful to really reverse engineer the way you do things by default, to track down like, well, where did I learn that strategy or where did I learn that behavior? For me, a lot of it tracks back to capitalism, colonialism, right?
Mhm.
Like really looking at how I've been conditioned to get as much as I can, to extract, to take, to be successful at the expense of, anybody who's in my path. And I want to make this really not tangible, but really like specific for people who are listening to us talk about this right now. And maybe we can think of a couple of examples within our businesses where we've really had to question, like, okay, so here's a thing that I'm doing. Where did that belief come from? For me, I think thinking about marketing and selling is like the easiest place to start. It's one of the most outward facing things that we do as business owners. And also it's some of the most important activities that we do as business owners. And I think about, you were kind of hinting at this earlier, the way that we maybe sell things in our businesses and how on a sales page, we might put a bunch of big promises. All sorts of people teach us to make big promises when we're trying to sell something. I'm going to completely transform your life. You're making, 5 figures right now. You're going to make 6 figures after you do this thing. Where the bigger promises you can make, the more excited people are going to be to join your programs. I think that was like one of the first places where I really had to stop and question, wait a minute, who told me that was how I'm supposed to do it? And when I would track back, like, who told me that or where did I learn that? Then I started getting kind of clear, Gina, like, oh, I don't feel good about that. Like that doesn't, I don't want to make those promises to people. I don't want to make promises I can't keep. I don't want to entice people to buy things from me that maybe they can't afford or maybe they don't really need. That's an example that's coming to mind for me. I'm wondering if there's any examples coming to mind for you.
Yeah, I mean to just add to what you were just saying about the selling. So I had an experience. This is how long, it's been probably 15 years, where I was just doing it was like a discovery call with a coach who was offering a mastermind. I was new to mastermind programs at the time. And quite honestly, I was in a place at the time where I was like, I think mastermind should be free to everybody. I've since changed my mind because now I understand that goes involved in the program.
Right.
But as I was having this conversation with this person who was selling me on the program was, I believe it was $18,000. I was just starting out in my business. I did not have $18,000 to be spending on a mastermind, let alone a lot of things, because I was just starting out. And I was honest and said, listen, I think what you're offering is great. It's just outside of my budget. And before I could say anything else, and I don't know what the person's intention was. It could have been totally, coming from a good place. But the person suggested some ways that I could pay for it. One of those things was to take a line of credit on my house. Another thing was to spread it out over credit cards. The third thing was to borrow money from friends and loved ones. For me, I mean, even as I'm talking about it now, I'm having a little bit of a physical reaction because I remember in that moment thinking, this person isn't concerned with me. They're concerned about making their numbers. And it made me feel terrible because I initially really liked this person. But when that happened, it was such a turnoff. I never reached out to them again. I still know who they are. They're still in the business. I've never recommended them and I would never work with them because and I may be wrong. Like that may be like, she may have a way of like, this is how it works for me and this is how I do it. And it aligns with my ethics, but it did not align with mine.
It reminds me of that expression, profits over people. Or, hopefully the reverse. We want to put people over profits, but our society has conditioned us to put profits over people.
And do you know why? Because we don't understand that profit comes from in the people.
Right.
When you invest in your people, that is where the profit is. But we have been taught the opposite.
Right. Well, it's the extractive thinking versus the humanistic thinking. If we think of people like machines, like they're just machines in a factory, it's how can we extract as much quote value from them as possible versus
Yes.
like what you're saying is like you didn't feel cared for. You didn't feel seen and acknowledged as a human who was in a vulnerable position trying to make a big decision. And I kind of feel like this profits over people as I'm just like running through all of the kind of ethical dilemmas I've worked through in the past year or so. They almost all can track back to profits over people. That conditioning is the first thing that pops up. And I feel like once you start getting clear on your code of ethics, right? Once you start really discerning your core values and your personal ethics, you start to become more somatically aware of when you're making decisions in your business that don't feel right. Like at this point for me, like my body actually tells me before my brain realizes what's happening. I'll feel a little sick inside, like kind of like you were saying, like just thinking back to that story about how, oh my God, I'm having a physical reaction right now. Like something will start to make me feel a little sick or a little bit pained. And then my brain will go, oh my gosh, oh, I think this is one of those moments where there's a default capitalistic conditioning that is trying to override the wisdom of the body, which is saying, this doesn't feel right. You need to not make this decision. You need to do something different.
Right. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that sometimes our experiences can be positive in what we learn with ethics. So I'll give you a quick example from this is when I was a kid. As a kid, we used to go to this meat market, like a butcher shop, and it was a family owned. This guy owned this place, and my mom would take me. I was a kid every time we'd go get the meat, blah blah blah. And I remember as I was getting a little older, my mom was having a conversation with him, and he said something about, oh, my mom had written, the person in front of us had written a check for the groceries, because back then that's what you did. And my mom said, when it was our turn, she said, I noticed that you don't ask for a driver's license or you don't ask for any information like where they typically would. And he said, well, would you like to know why? And my mom said, yes, I would. And he said, because I've owned this business for something like 30 years. I've owned this business for 30 years. He goes, and I've only had one person bounce a check once. And she said, how is that even possible? And he said, because I trust the people that come into my store, that they're good people, and that if they bounce a check, it's not because they're trying to rip me off, it's for other reasons. And I've got some flexibility where I can wait for my money if that's what I need to do, because they're going to come back into the store. And if they don't, then it's okay. It's a loss. Now, here I am, like 185 years old now. That butcher shop is still functioning alive and well, and they still practice in the same way that they did. Now,
what did that teach you?
What it taught me was that not all buyers are bad. And sometimes in business, we are taught that our buyers are wrong. We know better. We know better than you. That's why we're here to sell you. We're the experts.
Right.
But this was a man who was like, hey, I could learn something from these people who buy from me. If I trust that they're human beings and they're good people, let's see if they really are. And they were. Because anytime he had a check bounce, they would come back in and he wouldn't charge a service fee or anything. No, I'm not saying that's how everyone should practice business, but I learned something about treating people like people.
Yeah. Yes. He was the epitome of people over profits. And I think the undercurrent of what he was saying was, I trust that the money is going to be there when the money needs to be there. I trust. And I wonder if trust is a huge element of what's missing for so many of us that are operating from fear. So if we can just circle back to the beginning of this conversation, right? Many of us just default to thinking that you can't be ethical and successful. If you got to pay your bills, you got to make money in your business. Like you can't, like ethics are a luxury. We kind of treat ethics like this luxury. And if we really unpack that and ask ourselves, what am I afraid of? What am I really afraid of if I make the ethical choice? If I say no to marketing strategies that feel slimy, if I say no to sales tactics that feel manipulative, if I say no to client relationships where I know I'm going to have to like sacrifice something that means something to me, what is that consequence going to be? And I think for most of us, the fear is I won't have enough money.
I 100% agree. I also think that it's important that if we are, let's use that example. that if I'm in a place and I'm saying, well, I have to make money, so I'm going to continue, I think I need to continue this practice because I don't feel like I have a choice, then we don't get to be upset when we get a client or customer, however you define your market, who behaves unethically. It can't be like, I can behave this way because I need the money, but you have to pay me and you can't do these other things because your ethics don't match mine, right? That's not how this works. So I think it's important for us to look at, if it is a scarcity thing around, I won't make money. Well, are those the people that you want to work with? Because if you really have experience and you have, a good track record and you have something of value to offer the market, then offer that to people who will value you and they will pay you and they will value that you treated them like human beings.
Yeah, the two pieces that are really feeling important to me right now are treating, it sounds so silly to say, like so obvious. It's like treating people with respect and compassion, like really putting people before the money, like what they need. I mean, this story about the grocer is so powerful that this man is just like, I just trust, it's going to be okay. If someone bounces a check, it's probably because they ran out of money. It's not because they were trying to pull one over on me. Like, they probably ran out of money. And that means that like whatever's going on in their life is a whole lot worse than me being $50 short in my cash flow or whatever. So putting people over profits, really caring about people. And I want to talk to you more about this piece. And then we trust that everything's going to be okay and the money's going to show up. And I know this trust piece is something that you were really talking with me about when I was in my ethical dilemma that I can't talk about yet, but I am excited to share it one day when I can. But you said it to me then of like, Megan, yeah, if you choose option A, like you're going to make a lot more money is what you're telling yourself. But I don't know that that's actually true. That I think if you choose B, if you choose the thing that feels right to you, that is in alignment with your core values, with your personal ethics, like that's where the money is really going to flow to you. So tell me more about where you think trust fits into this ethics versus success dilemma.
It's hard. I mean, I would love to say like, oh, you just have to trust and it's all going to be fine. It is hard to trust, right? And it's usually based on prior experiences. So what happens is we have experiences that teach us not to trust others, not to trust ourselves, not to trust the bigger picture. And so when we have that trifecta, how can we get out of a distrust loop, right? Because we're like, no one's in it with me. This is all on me. And I've certainly been in situations like that. But I think that when we start to look at things and understand that trust is not a reward system. It's not a thing of I put this in and I get this back. It's not a transaction, but understanding that if you want to be successful, being clear on what is success. Is it making X number of dollars and that's it? Is it making sure that you have your health and you have all your expenses covered so that you can enjoy your life? Is it having a balance in life? Like all of these things have a value attached to them. They may not be a monetary value, all of them, but they have a value. So it's really important to define like, what is the value for me? What's really, really important to me? Yeah. And if it's money and money alone, that's also important to know.
Right.
Because it's also important to understand the impact that can create, positive or negative or otherwise. But I think that trust piece and understanding that it's not a straight line. Like I said, it's not a transaction. For me, I was in corporate America for many years. I had opportunities where, I got to do some really ethical things. And then I started learning some things about the company I was working for that felt very unethical. And I was terrified to leave because my experience was if I left, I wouldn't have another job. I was a woman of color. There were all kinds of discrimination that I was facing. So I stayed much longer than I should have. And I will be honest, when I left, I was relieved and I was terrified because everyone told me, you're never going to make that kind of money again. You're never going to be successful like that. Everybody projected their own fear and it did not help. So when I started my business, I was making money. But in the back of my head, I was like, I'm not making as much as it's what everybody said. I'm not making as much as I thought I would. And I kept at it, kept at it. And it wasn't until the year when I exceeded, like I was making good money, but when I exceeded my corporate salary and benefits, then I was able to really loosen the grass.
Mm.
So that was my work to do.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine, and I still think about this. I go, so what would have happened if I was able to loosen that grass before I hit that number and really trust? I probably would have exceeded the number, or it could have happened sooner.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not, but maybe. And to also understand that if we do give ourselves permission to trust, and we really do trust in that and trust in the bigger picture, that a payoff will come. It just may not come in our time. You and I talked about something before we got online here, and I said, this is something I've been waiting for my whole career, and it's finally happening. But if somebody would have told me, so let me tell you how your career path is going to go, I would have been like, I'm going to find something else to do. I don't
Right. Yeah. I love this little nugget. Trust is not a transaction.
It's not.
That is gold. I mean, the alliteration of the T's is delightful, but trust is not a transaction. And that's going to stay with me for a long time because again, this capitalistic conditioning that we're trying to deprogram ourselves from a little bit in this, as we become aligned with our values and making values-based decisions, that conditioning is very transactional. Right? Like our default way of existing in the society and our businesses is transactional. I give you X, you give me Y, right? Yep. I give you this many minutes of my time. You give me this many dollars. I give you this piece of, coursework. You give me this much money. I mean, everything is this transaction. So of course, it's really normal that when we start trying to show up in our businesses in new ways, that transactional conditioning kind of follows us wherever we go. And I think it's going to take a lot of intentional work to really slow down and look at where am I treating anything within my business as a transaction, including trusting that being in alignment with my values is going to lead me to abundance in whatever form that's going to take in my own life. And it's not a transaction. So I don't get to say, I'm going to make one really good decision, and then in return, the universe or whoever is going to give me $100,000 or a new house or no, that's not.
You can.
It's
how this works. Just not going to work out the way you want it to
on your timetable, right? Which is usually expedited. And that's another thing too. I think the more I really try to align my values with the way I run my business, the more I recognize that my timeline has to change. That the strategies that lead to really quick monetary success are often strategies that don't align with my values.
This is what I always say too, because I'm a big believer in this: short-term vision, short-term gains.
Yeah. Yes. There is so much here to unpack. I'm I wish we had 17 more hours so we could just have this conversation in full. But I want to zoom out here as we come to the end, Gina, and just kind of reflect some of the highlights of what we're talking about here. And specifically, I want us to think about how can we operationalize this conversation a little bit so that people can walk away and do something with whatever they're feeling in this moment. Because I think often when I listen to conversations about ethics or values, it feels very philosophical and it feels important and interesting. But I walk away being yeah, but what am I supposed to do with that? How do I take this into my business and change something? It can be so overwhelming. So I'm wondering if you have one or two next step suggestions for people listening who would really like to make their business more a reflection of their core values and personal ethics.
That's a great question. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. There are two things that come to mind. One is to take a look at your own business, and wherever you feel uncomfortable, look at why you feel uncomfortable. So for example, it might be, I think I charge too much for this. That doesn't mean that you have to lower your price, but what it might mean is that you can offer something else of value to really make that program more robust, to better justify the price point. If you're in a place of trying to figure out, I think I know my ethics, but I don't know my ethics. And how do I know if I know my ethics? Then one of the things that I would suggest doing is looking at people that you admire in business and people that you don't admire in business or strongly oppose.
Mm-hmm.
And these can be people that you've never worked with. They can also be people that you have worked with. Maybe it's a past boss or a colleague or things like that. So that you can understand, like, the people that you really like and resonate with, look at how they show up ethically. What resonates? What doesn't resonate? The people that you feel opposed to, why? And what resonates and what doesn't resonate. So I think it's important when we look at someone and we go, well, I can't stand that person because I think they act like they're better than everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that may be true, but it's also an opportunity to say, where do I show up like that in my own life?
Right.
It may not show up in my business, right?
Mm-hmm.
It may not show up in my business. It may show up somewhere else. Or it might be that person reminds me a lot of who I used to be.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so maybe it's time to put that down and let go of that. If that's not who you are anymore, you don't have to hang on to that anymore. Mm-hmm. So instead, lessen that so you can step into more of who you want to be and who you've become.
Wow. I feel like we started with a really big open-ended question and we didn't know quite where the conversation was going to take us. And we've like dialed down into these two really actionable invitations that people can take. And I guess like I implore you to pick one of the two things Gina just suggested and give yourself, 30 minutes on the clock and just sit down and think about it and explore it and see what it opens up for you. What breadcrumb. I always feel like this work is like a trail of breadcrumbs, like I do one little thing and then all of a sudden the next step reveals itself to me. And then you get to just be on this journey and we're here for you. So if you need support, like be in community, reach out, ask for help, ask for guidance. Don't try to do this really big emotional work in isolation because I don't know. I don't think it's possible to do it in isolation. It's just too big. Anything you want to say about that, Gina, about like connection? And
I echo, yeah. I mean, and share what you're learning and uncovering with someone that you trust who can either give you some feedback or can, reinforce by saying like, yes, you are on the right track, or yes, I do see those traits and behaviors in you. And I think it's important to do it with someone you trust so that if someone says, well, I think you're a little off the mark here,
mm-hmm.
right? You can also trust that what they're telling you isn't to put you down, but also because they really genuinely do care about you and want the same things that you want for you.
Wow. Gina, thank you so much for joining us here on the Rest and Success Code. I have one little fun question for you before we go, and it really connects to what you said earlier, that it's important that you define what it actually means for you to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And expanding your definition beyond monetary success. That's easy, right? The money stuff, like that's the easiest part of success. It's quantifiable, it's measurable. So I'm curious for you, like what is one thing that you do or create within your business that really adds to your quality of life that you consider as part of your definition of what it means to be wildly successful in your career?
Well, this is such a good question. I'm going to answer it with probably something that is not what you were thinking. It definitely,
I hope it's not.
Like part of how I do business is one thing I learned very on in my career was the importance of impact. And every time I have an experience with someone, even you and I getting on and doing this interview today, I think about how can I make sure that when Megan and I wrap up today, you walk away and you say, wow, that was a really good use of my time. That's really important to me because I never want to waste anybody's time because I think time is so valuable and so precious and I don't want to waste my time. Mm-hmm. And I want people to walk away saying, yeah, that was a great experience. To me, that's part of my success.
Leaving a feeling of impact within yourself and within the people that you interact with. Mm-hmm. Incredible. Gina, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. I am very grateful.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been great.
I hope this conversation has you feeling inspired to create your very own business code of ethics.
If you want to know more about what Gina is up to these days, you can find her at Arista Management Group, aristamanagementgroup.com. That's ARISTA managementgroup.com. She would love to hear from you. And while I have your attention, I would love to invite you to subscribe to the Deeply Rested newsletter if you haven't already. This is the place to connect with me personally and to hear everything that's happening behind the scenes, plus be the first to know about upcoming deep rest retreats. You can subscribe to the newsletter. We send it out weekly at deeplyrested.com/newsletter. I would love to see you in my inbox. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Deeply Rested. If you enjoyed this conversation, I would love to invite you to join the Deeply Rested weekly newsletter. You can sign up at deeplyrested.com/newsletter. I hope to meet you in my inbox very soon.